How dare you?
Good afternoon. My name is Colin Jones, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, digging into the developing media narratives and political rhetoric focused on Black Lives Matter protests here in Oregon. Since 1916, it has been a part of City Club's mission to inform its members and the community in public matters. Today, City Club is creating a dynamic, living, and currently virtual public square where conversations flourish and democracy thrives. Today's program is one of 10 virtual forums we're hosting this season, including 6 candidate debates for nearly every level of government. All are online and all are free. But there are 2 key ways you can help us support this public programming. First, I'd like to invite you to become a City Club member if you are not already. There has never been a more important time for the work of City Club's volunteer member leadership. You can learn more about membership online at pdxcityclub.org. Second, if you're already a member, or even if you're not, I'd ask you to make a donation to City Club. For nearly 100 years, City Club has relied on ticketed event revenue to fuel our work. But in this new all-digital world, we're taking a different approach. Make a gift of $5, $15, or $50 today to help us continue to convene thought-provoking debates and conversations. You can donate now by texting Support City Club to 44321. That's Support City Club, all one word, to 44321. Whether you become a member, make a gift, share the link with a friend, or just watch today's program to get informed, all of us at City Club want to thank you for participating. Thanks also to our amazing media partner, X-Ray FM, for broadcasting today's program across the region, to David Krug for his expert production skills, and to Shweta Morthy for her help brainstorming this program. Friends, neighbors, and members of City Club, these are unusual times and unusual circumstances. Today, I'm welcoming you from the City Club office because I don't have the internet bandwidth at home to do something like this. Many of our guests are streaming from their homes and juggling all of the distractions that come with that. But wherever we are sitting today, in our homes here in Portland and throughout the region, we are on stolen land. This is the territory of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, and Clackamas, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and Malala, the Wasco Cowlitz, and many other Indigenous people that have known the Columbia and Willamette rivers as their home for thousands of years. Together, we recognize their unbreakable connections to this land, and we honor the resilience of their ancestors and hope of future generations. As you settle in to watch the debate, perhaps your cat or dog will join you, or a young one will need your attention. Perhaps you're watching the recorded version of this debate while making dinner or listening while weeding the garden. Wherever you are, however we find you today, welcome. I'm so glad you can join us for this critical conversation. With that, it is my pleasure to get out of the way and welcome Kimberly A.C. Wilson, the Communications Director at Meyer Memorial Trust, and our esteemed moderator for today's program. Take it away, Kimberly.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Colin. I can't imagine a better way to spend the next hour than to be here and meet and listen to our speakers, 2 of whom are activists who are working to bring justice to Oregon through protest and reform, and a photojournalist whose images capture the purpose and energy of the movement for Black lives here in Portland. Let me set the tone a little bit for this conversation. Protests over George Floyd's death and other instances of police violence have been going on for 70 days in downtown Portland and in North and Northeast Portland. These are among the most sustained protests in the country. Tens of thousands of people have marched peacefully through our city. A primary message of the marchers and the organizers is really straightforward and somehow controversial. It's three words: Black Lives Matter. Three Black women coined this phrase: Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. They coined the phrase 7 years ago after George Zimmerman was acquitted in the death of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. It was necessary then, and it remains necessary today, to articulate that Black Lives Matter because there are hourly reminders that for many Americans, Black lives do not matter. We start today's discussion with Lamar Wise, who is the political coordinator for AFSCME Council 75, and Simab Husseini, vice chair and community organizers for the Oregon chapter of the Council on American and Islamic Relations. Lamar and Simab have maintained regular presence at the protests. For a decade, Lamar Wise has been focused on systemic anti-Black racism that underlines the racial disparities here in Oregon, from criminal justice to accessible healthcare to affordable housing. Since May 28th, which is 3 days after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Lamar has spoken to crowds in Portland, successfully pushing for millions of cuts to the Portland police budget. Simab Husseini is the co-founder and vice chair, as I said, to the Oregon chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. And it's also part of the Portland United Against Hate coalition. He's also the new interim chief impact officer at Brown Hope. He works to empower Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities in the state of Oregon, from civil liberties to resilience and mutual aid. His community activism began when he was just 13 in Los Angeles. Shortly before, 4 Los Angeles police officers, 3 of them white, were acquitted in the savage beating of Rodney King, an African-American man. Lamar, I'd like to start asking you to sort of frame up the primary narrative of the protests here in downtown Portland. The world has watched the expression of indifference that was on the face of Officer Derek Chauvin as he knelt on George Floyd's neck for what felt like an eternity of minutes. Is that what brought us here?
That's a great question. And first off, just like, thank you for having me on. I think this is more than an important conversation. It's an overdue conversation. And to your question, in some part, yes, that is what has brought us here. But also, it has been the decades of abuse from the system, from whether it be the police as an institution or just like state sanctioned violence. That is what has brought us here, right? Like the protests and the ongoing conversations that have taken place have been boiling up due to Black and brown bodies being destroyed, especially at a much higher rate than our white counterparts. And in addition to that, we're here because the vast majority of our concerns, demands, needs, wants have not been met by our leaders. And so, we've decided to do something about it. We've decided to take action in hopes that folks start to listen. And I think it's completely tragic that it's taken more death for us to talk about this. But we're here now, and I really hope that folks are able to take this opportunity seriously.
Really appreciate that. Already, after 70 days, or over the course of these 70 days, of nightly marches and daily marches and confrontations late in the evening, late into the morning hours with police, have already accomplished things that conventional wisdom said could not be done here in Oregon. Run down a few of the things that I'm aware of that have taken place. The Portland City Council cut the police budget by about $15 million and is redirecting that $15 million from the police department to other city programs and initiatives. Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler has removed school resource officers from Portland Public Schools, as well as the David Douglas, and Parkrose school districts. Multnomah County Attorney Rod Underhill, who's a longtime district attorney, retired 5 months earlier than planned so that the reform-minded new district attorney elect Mike Schmidt could take over this month. The Oregon legislature, following the lead of the People of Color Caucus, passed a slate of criminal justice reforms that had languished for years. This is just a tip of the iceberg of what has been accomplished so far. In the past week, Black-led organizations and activists have unveiled a sweeping set of policy demands that are aimed at rooting out entrenched systemic racism that has marred the state since its founding. What should be on that list of accomplishments but isn't yet? And what did I miss and what is happening, Lamar?
Yeah. Well, and I would say something else that I'm excited about is Commissioner Hardesty has put forth a ballot measure proposal in order to have a community oversight committee over policing. This would be actually one of the strongest community oversight boards in the nation, how it's currently constructed. It would be well funded and actually has teeth to it, which are the two main things that have destroyed any type of independent review or community oversight of policing. So I am excited about that. There are a few things that I want to make sure gets into the implementation of that new charter proposal. For example, a lot of our folks have said that, even if we have community oversight, if we have great staffing, something like that, we also want to make sure that they have the values and understand what anti-Blackness and anti-racism means. And so receiving those trainings and making sure that everyone's on the same page and knowing what to look out for in our systems and in our structures that got us here in the first place, right? We are here because the vast majority of our systems in place right now were built upon racism, and racism is embedded in the very fabric of the policies that govern these institutions. And so we want to be cognizant of that. We want to make sure that we are leading with that after this gets passed in November, and ensure that that the commission, that the folks who will be part of this oversight committee, that the staff is all on the same page about what it means to actually start to dismantle the anti-Blackness and racism in policing. And so I want to, I guess, lift that up, and things that aren't done yet. I want to highlight that even though we were able to get a $15 million cut from the Portland Police Bureau, the original ask was for 50. And this $50 million ask cut actually came from the Portland African American Leadership Forum and Unite Oregon. Those were the two organizations that actually put out the long list of demands that a lot of the protesters we ended up just like adopting because it was so their demands were so robust. But we still need to cut the Portland Police Bureau by $50 million. We're still looking to cut the sheriff's office department by a similar amount. The Portland State University, they still have an armed campus. Actually, when I was part of the Oregon Student Association, one of the things that I worked on was disarmament of PSU, and it's been such a battle, and that is still not done, even though there was a person practically killed on campus not too long ago. And so we I feel as though that we have evidence, we have stories, we have momentum to actually like create these changes and be responsive to community, especially the communities that have been directly impacted by police brutality, which is the Black community amongst others, right? Um, and uh, and we have decision makers that have the power to act. And so we're hoping that we can continue to shed light on those asks that have been out. And I can tell you that the longer that we wait, the more that we will ask, because it, there is a lot happening around us, but the fact remains that we still have not abolished policing as it stands right now. And we need to start to rethink and reimagine what safety looks like for us, and what we can do as a community to bring us to a place where everyone is getting what they need in order to feel whole.
Appreciate that answer. I know CMOB, you wanted to answer as well. And I wanted to maybe as you're thinking CMOB and also Lamar, use terminology that I know gives angst and agita to people. I'm sure among the audience tonight, this afternoon, the idea of abolishing police. Can both of you speak a little bit about that and what that means, and how that fits into this? CMOB?
Um, yeah, I mean, abolition of police is quite a feared term, and it's one that we even discuss within our national organization at CARE, as something to kind of be cautious about. But personally, myself, as speaking as an individual, I am an abolitionist, and but I believe there are practical ways to be able to approach abolition, and it's not all chaos and anarchy that it's made out to be. Defunding strategies and the aggressive defunding strategies that we're asking for in this protest are forms of abolition. You want to demilitarize police. You want to be able to make sure that the Portland Street Response is there instead of Portland Police Bureau when it comes to the mental health and care for individuals on the street suffering in a crisis. You want to be able to expand that system beyond just 5 million. That's paltry. It went from 500,000, which was, a van or two, to 5 million, and it's a great increase. But these are forms of abolition. These are strategies of defunding with a lens that's abolitionist. Um, that's probably the best way I can explain the lens of which I travel through.
Lamar, how much of a complication is it that the terminology can off-put people who should be supporting the idea of abolishing the overreach of policing into social care here in Albany?
Yeah. I mean, I think the language could be shocking, but at the same time, actually, one of the times that I spoke, at the pleasure of actually speaking with one of my best friends, Ricardo Lujan, who is currently the political director for Latino Network. He spoke about what it means to abolish ICE, right? And I actually think some of the things that we saw not too long ago, especially when the federal agents were here, we saw a lot of the same tactics that ICE had used on folks at the border, here in Portland, which is, just like driving up on people, putting them in vans and leaving. And so there's been this movement to abolish ICE, and ICE hasn't been here actually for that long. And we've seen the harm that it has done to our very communities. It's along the same lines in terms of policing, right? Uh, we're not saying that 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 we can't have like an entity that continues to keep us safe. what we are saying though is that the very basis of policing is rooted in uh, uh, slavery and making sure that white people's property is protected. And so the very idea of this institution still being here is a problem. It has just been protected decade after decade after decade and funded even more decade after decade after decade, while a lot of our social services that if they were fully funded, like our folks wouldn't even have to have interactions with police, right? If you can imagine with me, if we had fully funded mental health services, if we had fully funded shelter and houselessness services, if we did have a transportation system that was free and open to the public, like we just with those things we start to reduce the amount of conflicts that we have within our society. And so it's really a conversation when we talk about abolition. It's really a conversation starter of well, what should our world look like? What should our world look like if we were able to take a moment to rethink and reimagine? And so I think that's what I would pose to the public now is to kind of sit with it, sit with the uncomfortability, but think about it a little bit. And it's okay because at the end of the day, I just can't continue to sit here and watch Black people continue to be murdered on my timeline. I just like can't. And I, for me, like I think of it kind of in a warfare mind state, right? Like my people are dying, and my my reaction is to fight back. My reaction is to protect. And so we want to wake people up to the fact that like things need to change rather quickly in order for us to actually feel safe.
Seema, let's talk a little bit about the protesters. You have been training people here in the state to know about their rights for years. What do these demonstrations tell you about and tell us about um, what it's like to exercise your right to protest in Portland?
Yeah. So tactics used by all forms of law enforcement officers is in practice of violating people's rights regularly. Knowing your rights has saved many that have been detained from further risk of false persecution. And the detainments that have led to charges have mostly, if not all, been nonviolent offenses. But law enforcement officers, including our current chief, along with the Portland Police Association president, will have you believe otherwise. Um, but, of those out there that have been doing a lot of the Know Your Rights work, NLG, ACLU of Oregon have done a fantastic job at the protests, ensuring that their presence is not in just being legal observers for instance, like the ACLU of Oregon, but also scribing NLG jail support hotline numbers on people's arms and dropping off KYR resources throughout the protests. You'll see the green helmets walking around. Those are all the NLG folks. You'll see the blue vests. Those are the ACLU of Oregon folks. They've been there consistent every single day. We at Care Oregon have also been very active, mostly also reinforcing information through social media, which has been stellar, especially for us on Twitter. Also, by keeping people informed of their rights and protesting. So we've had a steady presence with live tweeting, documenting, as well as having consistent and steady eyes on the ground. We've allowed our eyes and ears to be a resource of tangible information to city, county, state legislators, and elected officials. Coalitions we are in have helped shape community testimony to these lawmakers, and we've been afforded the opportunity to speak with People of Color Caucus and assist in shaping some of the legislation in the emergency sessions last week. Um, all this while the courts are currently forcing protesters that were detained on conditional release if they don't, being that, you know, you will get released if you don't go to another protest, and reportedly in violation of their First Amendment rights. So that would possibly be unconstitutional, I would say. But, you know, so yes, Know Your Rights have had a very, very large and positive effect. And you can see nightly how folks in the crowd are trying to reinforce this amongst themselves.
That's really great. I wasn't aware about the courts making conditional release on not participating.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be having
It's
much of
been
an effect.
No, it's and it's unfortunate. You know, we this is just proof of a system that we've been sitting in, where we understand the specific history in Oregon. Every single state has its own unique history of racism, and it just goes to show, like, the incrementalism doesn't solve problems, especially ones that are so deep ingrained in this country as racism. Um, and Black and brown bodies, particularly those that are Black and indigenous, have been bearing the brunt for 400 or 500 years, and that's been laid in an example for those that have emigrated into this country now, such as my family. So, you know. Resiliency is one that we need to focus on, but when you look at court systems that are actually kind of joining in these processes, and then we have to fight it at a grander scale through, I think Don't Shoot Portland has a couple lawsuits going with Oregon Justice Resource Center. These are the unfortunate steps we have to take to be able to kind of take back this ground, but I do see this positive movement taking place.
Oh, I'm wondering if both you and Lamar could talk with me a little bit about the narratives that have been shaping up over the last 70 days here in Portland. Lamar, you mentioned the snatching of people up in unmarked cars by federal agents who are unidentified. The stories about the lasers being shined into the eyes of law enforcement officers, the wall of moms, the naked Athena. How do these moments fit into the narrative of what people are asking for with these peaceful protests in Portland? Lamar, just start me off.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I guess I first want to say that we have to stay focused, right? Like I think that there have been a ton of distractions out there in terms of where like where the narrative has gone to, especially like when folks have brought up uh, just like what's happening downtown in terms of the violence or yeah, like what's happened with like the wall of moms and just like I feel like at the end of the day, everyone that has shown up because they believe that Black Lives Matter, and that's what we need to stay focused on, is that Black Lives Matter. And from that, from the groundswell of grassroots support that has been out night after night, like change will come. We've already seen it. Change will continue to come. We will win. But I think that we need to continue to focus our narrative um, on Black Lives Matter, and then from there continue to work with the community uh, to to operationalize what that means in policy and in our institutions. Whether that means uh, starting to rethink and reimagine what those institutions look like, or um, uh, starting to create new ones that serve the people. And so the narrative, I think, for me, stays the same, regardless of what has happened. What the media has reported here and there, but happy to talk more on that. But I guess that's my viewpoint.
That's great. Seema, I see you smiling. What do you
Oh,
think
I
about
mean, it's
the narratives that have?
it's I'm really honored to even be around folks like Lamar and Beth Nakamura on this panel, and I just find myself nodding aggressively to what Lamar says. the focus is Black Lives Matter because Black Lives Matter, and I've said several times that it's a statistical expression. Because Black lives need to matter, and they don't, and this country has proved it with its law enforcement. And since 9/11, you've had organizations like the Council on American Islamic Relations become birthed because of the persecution that Muslims are even facing. Currently, there's a Black Muslim. His name is Yunus Fikri, who was being forced into becoming an informant for a Portland Muslim community, and because he refused to, he was persecuted for all kinds of craziness. And you can look him up and find out more about it. But it's a current case that's actually going on right now against the federal government, I think for 8 years now. We lost an imam who fled the country. Well, he didn't flee, but he made a deal to leave the country and never come back as long as the federal government will leave him alone. That happened last year. These things are happening. Structures and systems are being built in this country that have always aggressively wanted to monitor people of color, particularly populations that are becoming more and more civically involved. It's like a fear, I guess. So, and as we spoke of before, aside from setting conditions to release, those that are detained, people are being treated the same way as always. You can't reform what's been built and designed with intention. Specifically here, people felt preyed upon after being kidnapped. You have children that are still locked in cages. We know that for a fact that the people that have been detained by even the federal police when they came by and took over for a moment, that people were being detained and not being read their Miranda rights. Later being released with personal effects missing. Some just weren't given their prescription eyeglasses back. A lot of people are still without their cell phones over these past 70 days. What's happening? But this is behavior that you'll see replicated by law enforcement agencies across the board. Portland Police Bureau has been one that actually had this whole focus began with here in Portland. And I don't think the feds were a detraction, but more or less a reinforcement of the ideals that law enforcement has been practicing. It may be noted that the first day of munitions bans, due to the Don't Shoot PDX lawsuit through OJRC, Portland police barely showed up. And also believe that the change in police chiefs was involved with that, but protests remained largely peaceful. Same can be said day after the Fed's withdrawal. So imagine a protest without cops. And that allows that. So when PPB arrived again to take full control, their presence and actions were violent and still was. Last night I was out there. A young lady who was retreating was shot with this green clay munition that just exploded on her back, completely unarmed, indiscriminate. So, it begs one to wonder that the escalation of violence by law enforcement, is it a choice of optics? Do they prefer this? Because without escalation, protests will solely focus on messaging of demands to defund and mutual aid like food and clothing that they've been doing. So until then, even with oversight, and I look forward to the strengthening of the IPR systems, but you still cannot change and challenge union arbiters successfully. We've not successfully done it once in the history of Portland police. Law enforcement officers will attack indiscriminately, and they'll do it again with impunity, and they enjoy that impunity.
That measure in November will be really helpful.
Yes.
To sort of create the mechanism for accountability ahead of those negotiations, I think.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your wisdom, Lamar and Simab. I hope you'll stay with us. Actually, we have an audience question I want to throw in here, if we could, before we turn to Beth. Both of you mentioned the Independent Police Oversight Commission that Commissioner Hardesty has proposed. What do you think the biggest obstacles are to success for that, and how can they be overcome? Lamar, you're nodding. Is this the
Yeah,
question you're eating?
yeah, it'll be the police union spending $1 million against it. That's gonna be the biggest. That's gonna be the by far the biggest barrier. They are not gonna sit this one out. If anything, we will probably see national police money come into Portland, because I like if we pass this, it won't stop here, and they know that. They know that that this model will continue to spread, and then they won't be able to get away with the things that they've been able to get away with. Yeah. So look out for that. Follow the money, because I think that's what we'll see.
And
Yeah,
it sounds like you
I
sort of make an invitation to others who might want to support so that it isn't outfunded. That the efforts to create that commission are not outfunded. Sima.
Yeah, I mean, I just Lamar hit it right on the head. You have to focus on the Portland Police Association, and what they're going to do. But also, I would ask everyone to really pay attention. There is a Portland Police Reform Network out there, and we are a coalition that's aggressively working on this on the talks of the Portland Police Association contract. I think everyone should pay attention. This contract got pushed off due to our pandemic, good old pandemic, canceled 2020 hashtag. Um, and I would make sure that, come first of the year, that we follow very closely what's happening in Portland Police Association contract, and make sure that we are participating in it, and that we are limiting powers. Again, we have currently a person who adores Nazi memorabilia, who had created shrines in the city of Portland, who's still employed by Portland Police Bureau, simply because the Portland Police Association saw nothing wrong with this particular officer. And, they still have a career there. You've had members that have killed Black people, that were unarmed, that have promoted into DPSST, which is, the body of safety standards in the state of Oregon for law enforcement. A lot of things, but law enforcement is very important, and we need to focus on the changes locally and tight, because if we can change the system from within, that's how you progress, and you can expand upon these changes. You're creating a platform from city to city, through the state, and then you're letting the country know what's possible in other states and cities.
I love that. I love transitioning more to narrative, but that is going to stay with me. It's hopeful, and it's also within our grasp, and so I appreciate very much that context. I'm gonna shift over here to Beth Nakamura, and welcome her into the conversation. Beth is an multi-Emmy award-winning visual journalist who's been telling stories through her lens for a hot minute. She's also an instructor at the University of Oregon's Multimedia Journalism Graduate Program. She's been shooting for the Oregonian since 2004. Beth, you've been shooting these protests, photographing protests for years, and photographing these particular protests day and night for several months. What is a story that you've been asked to document?
Well, there's a lot that's gone on here on Portland streets for 60 plus days. And there's a lot of noise and distractions in that, and a lot of shifting of the story, sometimes hour by hour. So it's a lot that we're dealing with. But I think speaking for myself and just organizationally, the focus, as we have always tried to keep it, is on elevating the voices of Black lives in this, what could only really be described as an uprising, and also through a framework of some police brutality and accountability. I mean, those are key things, I think, that we've always tried to stay focused on in our coverage. And I'm certainly no, omniscient narrator in this. I'm just a pair of boots on the ground for much of the time here in the protests.
Lamar earlier was saying, and it sounds like that's what you've been working on, that at the core of the protests are really calling out excessive force that's been used by law enforcement against Black people. And it's ironic that the police response to the protests has itself been described as excessive, that here's this moment to actually call out the excessive use of force, and in response, just more of it. Journalists, though, in particular, and yourself included, have found themselves to be among the victims of violent policing here in Portland during these protests. Attorneys with the ACLU of Oregon have filed a class action lawsuit in June that claimed that Portland police were targeting and attacking journalists as well as legal observers. That same month, an officer forcefully pushed you, Beth, from behind with a baton near the Multnomah County Justice Center while they were attempting to clear demonstrators from the area. Can you speak a little bit, Beth, about how targeting journalists limits the public's access to the messages and images of protest here on our streets?
Well, I want to say, when I was slammed by that baton, I was repeatedly showing my identification and with my hands up and saying who I was. So there's that, which frankly seems like a distant memory now, given the arrival of the feds and how the level of aggression and just sort of the enormity of the story that we were up against. I recently spoke with a woman from the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I want whoever's listening to consider this, that a global nonprofit whose focus is press freedoms around the world and the safety of journalists has pivoted their attention to our city. In advance of talking to her, I there's a sort of loose tribe of journalists on the ground who've been covering this. And I sort of got a read from the New York Times photographer, Washington Post, Reuters, Getty, just a bunch of people that I had been working with about these assaults on journalists, and everyone just erupted into laughter. It's so bad. It was basically like a joke. So I got hit directly with some sort of munitions, like a canister, on my knee. By federal officers. I couldn't, I also got one on the small of my back, some kind of rubber bullet. I had a massive bruise. Much of that is healed now, but for at least 3 days, I couldn't bend my left leg. And so that, it impairs what we're, it inhibits our work, I have to say, as an American, as someone who's devoted my life to what I think of as a form of public service, it's dispiriting to be attacked by the state. There's that. I don't like to think about that too much. I try to keep my focus on just doing what I can with my tools to sort of mirror and reflect back to the community sort of what all is happening at these protests, and not make it about us. So there's that.
Do you have the sense that by targeting journalists and putting journalists into the kind of experience with police space that the protests were surrounded around, or violent policing that takes the lives of people, that injures people, that by sharing that experience with journalists, that there's sort of a backfiring effect, that newsrooms that might otherwise really intend to be and make efforts to be real impartial observers to what's going on can't help but recognizing that there's some truth to the claims of people who are holding signs and who are marching and saying this happens and it shouldn't?
Well, I think, there's been sort of a reckoning within journalism, I would say. I don't know that it started with this Black Lives Matter movement. I think probably I could see the beginnings of this with the when our president was elected, frankly, and how this sort of normal default to both sides and a more passive voice, which I think is a traditional thing we do. Has shifted, and ever more so, with this. I mean, systemic racism in all of our systems, embedded in our founding for centuries, in our healthcare system and outcomes, in education, in housing, in the criminal justice system, and police killing with impunity. These are objectively bad things. So using more full-throated language around that, yes, that you will see that in our language and framing.
If you're just joining us, I'm speaking here with Beth Nakamura, who is a photojournalist from the Oregon newspaper in Portland, and she's been covering protests here since May. We're talking a little bit about competing narratives and and what these protests have been able to accomplish so far, and will continue to accomplish. I'm wondering, Beth, as a photojournalist, if there's an image that you have taken or seen that captures the narrative of what is happening and what is being asked for.
I've thought about this, Kimberly. I don't know that there's a singular image. I know that we tend to gravitate and gather around those sort of more iconic iconography, and that sort of takes root and narratives form out of that. I think this protest, this movement, and what we're talking about is more complicated, much more so, more dimensional. I hate to put all that work on a single image. I'm not sure that would do justice to what we're in right now. I will say there was a scene that really stuck with me. I try to keep my own feelings in check through all this, and just really focus outwardly and try to sort of be a conduit for others and reflect that back out there. But sometimes I am stopped. And certainly I'm taking it all in. So it's not that I lack for feeling here, but sometimes I'm stopped. And there was a moment where it was the night, in that sort of second wave of uprising after the feds arrived, and the mayor came into the protest for this sort of listening session. And, at that point, the streets were filled with as many thousands of people as there were at the beginning of the original Black Lives Matter marches, which were astounding when they took place here. I'll never forget that. But there's a small, the leaders it's a fluid situation on the ground, and you see leadership kind of emerge and come and go, and there's some drama, and it's a lot of bodies moving this movement forward. So, but there's always been consistently, I see some of the same faces, and there's always this little gaggle of young people, and I don't want to say who they're connected to, because I would not be 100% sure about that right now, but they're familiar to me. So there's 8,000+ people on the streets in front of the Justice Center in the federal courthouse. And this little gaggle of people are up there on, the Justice Center has these little sort of pillars. And so they're standing on the pillars. There's the mayor is there, and all eyes are sort of on this moment. And this one girl has his attention and hesitates and says, I'm not really smart enough, so I don't know if I'll let you talk to this person, and sort of defer to one of the other members of the group. And it like physically hurt me to hear that. It was I look at the people who've done this and who continue to do this, and just the feat, of the sheer force of their will. And I see her and them, and I don't know her or anything about her story, but I looked over at her and I thought, here you have the mayor essentially on his feet. You have the entire city before you. You have the eyes of not only the city, but the nation, and in fact, the globe in that moment. And so, define smart.
And she's
And
been part of that to bring that attention.
exactly. That small, like that Margaret Mead small group of people, and her, she was front and center in that. And, I don't want to overly focus on her, but it was sort of, it was, it spoke to me about the weight that bears down on someone and the body of research to back that up about just how difficult it is to get out from under that. And yet, through and yet there she is, and all evidence to the contrary wasn't seeing her power. It hurt, and that's a small thing, and I don't want to overstate it. Certainly, uh, I'll never forget any of this, and and it continues. I covered the protest last night, so the work goes on.
I can kind of see her in my mind with your description. And
Yeah, I don't. Someday I'd like to tell her that. Just as a woman, I'm a photojournalist, but we all have many identities. I'm a mother and a member of this community. So
I would love to invite Lamar Wise, if you're just joining us, political coordinator for AFSCME Council 75, and Seemab Husseini, who's the vice chair and community organizer for the Oregon chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, back into this discussion. Is there an image, and it doesn't have to be a photograph, is there a moment that really captures for you what these protests have accomplished and will accomplish? Seemab, you go first.
Yeah, actually, let me grab it. So, in honor of Beth Nakamura, I wanted to choose one of her photos.
oh wow.
Now, this right here spoke volumes to me because the militarization that's actually taking place within our cities. And when I say militarization, we have free militarized equipment coming to all local police jurisdictions, including Mayberry, if Sheriff Andy wanted one, due to the federal government's 1033 program. It's just free hand-me-downs. We've, when it comes to seeing something like this, in Portland, and thanks to Commissioner Hardesty, we've seen ourselves withdraw from a secretive operative force of the FBI called the Joint Terrorism Task Force. With that being said, they still reside in Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. They still operate in Oregon State Police. These are systems that were designed since 9/11 to keep track and watch Muslims for possible ties to terrorism. That's Islamophobia, statistically a weak focus compared to FBI's and Department of Justice's own research, where rising far-right groups deemed far greater threats and actually have body counts in the last 10 years that are incredible. So, we're seeing systems that are built federally, putting their militarization into cities with the 1033 program that brings free weapons and property to local law enforcement. You can't defund what is free. It's because of our credit that we get to find out all these things and really understand, because of journalists such as Beth Nakamura. She calls herself a photojournalist. I mean, you speak volumes with just a simple picture. And so I would challenge that the Portland Police Bureau and the Portland Police Association to acknowledge the truth and overwhelming truth in our local and independent journalists that are reporting on the ground. I did cheat. I have one more picture. Sure. This guy right here. This
What are
is
we looking?
quite disgusting. Yes, so this is basically a pool of gas residue and sediments from that are just washing off into the storm drains the next morning after being pressure washed. This comes from Nicholas Lee, who's also an independent reporter and photojournalist out there on the streets, out there every single night. And you know, this tells us, the health impacts that we're not actually talking about, of indiscriminate use of gas munitions, the lingering effects of constant exposure. What are they? Indiscriminate use of crowd control munitions where they're firing upon peaceful protesters and they do it with impunity. Um, what are the effects to the environment? Northeast and North PDX residents are complaining at night and the following day of residual gas effects. They can still smell it in the air when they go walk their dog or whatnot. Heavy use of gas at the Justice Center, leaving layers of residue everywhere the following morning. Women are talking about, issues with their monthly cycle, and that it's actually been coming at odd times and incredibly consistent. Um, Local independent journalists such as Nick Lee documenting the pressure washing of gas residue and sediments into storm drains, and it's these are things that we want to also kind of consider, when we become militarized as a society. What are we welcoming, and why we need to defund, and why we talk about defunding? It's getting rid of these things and making sure that we are placing systems that actually care about the human impact of their job.
I know Colin's going to say that we're out of time, but we did have a question I want to just touch on because what you just said. It's a question to all of you, particularly Lamar and Simab. Do you think that most media outlets are doing justice to covering the movement, and what would you want to see them do differently? And I'm thinking, I'm going to add to that and say most media outlets, but also the independent journalists whose work you're lifting up as well. Do you feel like the stories are getting out there that need to? Lamar?
Yeah. So I think that there has been some missed opportunities with some of the media. I think a lot of the independent journalists that have been on the ground have been amazing in actually showing, hour by hour, like minute by minute, what's going on. I will say that uh, when when the media tries to conflate, a tagged building or broken glass to the destruction of black and brown bodies, it's no comparison. In this weird kind of like divide that happened with in some of the media outlets of trying to, I think, like divide the conversation of Black Lives Matter and just like this quote unquote violence that is going on. That's something that's concerning to me because there are folks that have been affected by the Portland Police Bureau, and their stories still have not been highlighted by media. Like folks with direct stories, like either their family member was killed, or they themselves had been injured. Like we've had to do what we can to uplift those stories on our own, and so I would highlight that as just like what I've witnessed.
Appreciate that. I also stole your opportunity to talk about your image, and really what tells the story of this summer of protest for Black Lives for you.
Yeah, I'll answer that real quick. I mean, I don't have a picture. I feel like it's so many awesome pictures have been taken. But I will say the image that comes to my head, the vision that I have is is Black restoration, right? Like Black fullness and Black joy. um, like when I wake up and do the things that I do for work or for the community, I like I do it because at the end of the day, like I believe people make better decisions when they're happy. I believe people are able to care for themselves and others better when they have their basic necessities met and that they're treated with dignity and respect. And so I want folks to imagine, like, the last time you've experienced joy and happiness, and really think about like what that would take for your Black and brown neighbors to experience that too and to feel whole. Um, and I'm mostly talking to white people, I guess, when I'm saying that, right? Like it I just feel like we've had to scrape for for lackluster policy in order for us to feel good, and we're fighting against what was made to be a white utopia, so we have to remember that as well. But I continue to put forth the reason why we're doing this, which is for us to be whole. Yeah.
That means so much to me. I think that brings us to the hour. I'm gonna pass it over to Colin, but I want to thank each of you, Beth, Simab, and Lamar, for your time and your energies and your work, and for making what's happening happen and sharing it with the world. So I really appreciate that. Colin, I'll stop talking.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for moderating today's conversation. And thank you, Lamar and Simab and Beth, for your insightful perspectives. Thank you, everyone who joined us online to watch from home. My last thing here, I have a longer thing, but we ran a little bit long, which I think was totally worth it. And so I'll just say, if you can find a way to support more programs like this, either become a member or make a donation, it is much appreciated. And with that, we are closed. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very honored to be part of this again, to be able to hang with Kimberly and Colin on this. And